David drove along the winding road leading to the old family home where he had spent his childhood. The landscape outside the window seemed familiar, but now, after the death of his parents, it looked gloomy and cold. The house stood in the shadow of tall trees, as if hiding from the world. When David got out of the car and approached the front door, a sense of unease washed over him. He opened the door, and the creak of the old hinges echoed through the empty house. The air inside was stale, and the silence oppressive. David slowly walked down the hallway, peering at the old family photos on the walls. In every room he felt someone's presence, as if the house was alive, waiting for his return. On the first evening, strange things began to happen. David heard scratching and rustling noises coming from under the floor and walls. The lights started flickering, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed thicker and more alive. At night, waking up to the sounds of whispers and knocks, David couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Fear slowly crept into his mind, turning every movement into a struggle against panic. The next day, deciding to explore the house, David climbed up to the attic. The narrow staircase creaked under his feet, and every step was a challenge. The attic was filled with old boxes covered in a thick layer of dust. Among them, he noticed an old trunk that clearly hadn't been opened for years. With effort, he opened the trunk and found stacks of old letters and diaries inside. They were neatly arranged, as if someone wanted them to be found. David began to read the letters, written in illegible handwriting, mentioning strange and grim events from his family's past. The diaries, full of notes about odd occurrences and terrible secrets, plunged him into an atmosphere of darkness and hopelessness. One letter in particular caught his attention. It spoke of mysterious disappearances of children from the village, allegedly connected to his family. The more David read, the more horror enveloped him. Each paragraph revealed new, increasingly terrifying details about his family's past. Reading through the diaries found in the attic, David felt his unease turn into genuine fear. The entries were filled with strange events and dark stories that seemed to stretch across generations of his family. One diary belonged to his great-grandmother, describing the disappearance of children from the village. She mentioned strange figures appearing around the house at night and disturbing sounds coming from the basement. Each page unveiled new, even more horrific details. His great-grandfather wrote about inexplicable accidents befalling the villagers and how some of them vanished without a trace. These records were filled with fear and despair, as if his ancestors knew something terrible but couldn't or wouldn't explain it. David discovered that many of these odd occurrences were somehow connected to the basement of the house. One diary mentioned that the basement was a place where his ancestors hid their darkest secrets. One entry told of found bodies that were mutilated beyond recognition, and that these deaths were attributed to unknown forces. Soon, David began to be plagued by horrific nightmares. Every night he saw his ancestors and their victims, suffering from unspeakable pain and terror. These nightmares were so vivid that David woke up in a cold sweat, feeling as if it all really happened. In one dream, he found himself in the basement, surrounded by old things and shadows that whispered in his ear. He saw the figures of his ancestors standing in the darkness, their eyes filled with hatred and fear. They reached out to him, accusing him of their suffering. Another time, he saw the children who had disappeared years ago wandering through the house, crying and calling for their parents. These images were so tormenting that David couldn't distinguish dream from reality. Each morning he woke up more exhausted and frightened. The nightly nightmares became so frequent that David began to fear falling asleep. He tried to keep himself awake, but fatigue and fear gradually eroded his mind. One night, in another nightmare, he found himself in the basement again. This time he found his great-grandfather there, looking at him with an expression of horror and guilt. David felt that his ancestor wanted to tell him something but couldn't. This dream was so vivid and terrifying that, upon waking, David couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to go down to the basement immediately and find answers there. Realizing that the nightmares might be connected to the basement's secrets, David resolved to confront his family's past to put an end to these horrors. Determined to uncover the truth, David descended into the basement, the source of his nightmarish visions. The old door creaked open, and he felt the cold, stale air emanating from the darkness. Armed with a flashlight, he cautiously descended the stairs, each step threatening to collapse under his weight. The basement was filled with old boxes, furniture, and debris covered in a thick layer of dust. Amidst the chaos, he began to find chilling evidence of past crimes. In one corner, he discovered an old wooden box with yellowed photographs peeking out. The pictures depicted faces of children who had disappeared many years ago. David's heart sank with horror as he recognized some of the faces, children he had grown up with who had also gone missing. Continuing his search, he stumbled upon a shelf with several glass jars containing strange, mutilated objects that might once have been human organs. His hands trembled as he realized these artifacts were tangible evidence of his ancestors' heinous acts. In another corner of the basement, he found an old, blood-stained knife and fragments of clothing soaked in dried blood. These discoveries filled him with deep revulsion and terror. It seemed as if every item was imbued with an evil that had lingered within those walls. The more he explored, the stronger his sense of being watched grew. In the darkness of the basement, among the old things and ghastly finds, he felt the presence of his ancestors, as if their spirits were bound to these grim reminders of their crimes. David knew he had to continue his investigation despite the mounting fear and disgust. After the dreadful discoveries in the basement, even stranger and more terrifying events began to occur in the house. David noticed that the mirrors in the room started showing him images that seemed too real to be mere illusions. The first encounter with this phenomenon happened when he walked past the mirror in the hallway. In the reflection, he saw the figure of a child with a distorted face standing behind him. Turning around, he saw no one, but his heart raced. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw something horrifying. Faces of his ancestors, twisted in expressions of pain and rage, flickered in the reflections. Sometimes he saw himself, but his reflection moved independently, whispering unintelligible words and showing scenes of brutal actions. In the bathroom mirror, he saw his great-grandfather standing behind him with a knife in hand, blood dripping onto the floor. These sinister images began to haunt him everywhere. The mirrors in the house became windows into a world where his family's past came alive in the most horrifying manifestations. He couldn't shake the feeling that his ancestors were trying to tell him something, but every attempt to decipher their messages brought only more fear. David decided to remove all the mirrors in the house, but it didn't help. The images continued to appear on glass surfaces, reflecting in the windows and even on his phone screen. He began to doubt his sanity, unsure of what was real and what was a product of his tormented mind. Every day, he felt the darkness of the past pulling him deeper, plunging him into an abyss of terror and despair. Determined to continue studying the discovered diaries and letters, David opened the old trunk he had been avoiding since its discovery. Inside were documents he hadn't yet read, and he immediately noticed that some letters were signed in blood. A chill ran down his spine as he picked up the first letter and unfolded it. The letter's content was filled with malice and threats. It was written with a trembling hand and exuded pure hatred towards his family. "Your lineage will be cursed to the last of you," one of the letters read. "You deserve only suffering and death." Each word pierced his consciousness, instilling a sense of inevitable doom. The more letters he read, the clearer it became that someone from the past had deliberately wished harm upon his family. The threats and curses were so detailed and sinister that it seemed the writer knew all the weaknesses and fears of his ancestors. Some letters described gruesome events that had already occurred, the disappearance of children, strange deaths, and accidents. David began to realize that these curses might be the reason for all the terrible events that had plagued his family for generations. Reading the letters, he felt the darkness seeping deeper into his mind, filling him with fear and despair. He didn't know who could be behind these letters, but he understood that the danger they posed was real. David began searching for clues that might lead him to unravel this grim mystery, but each new document only deepened his horror and helplessness. Continuing his search, David discovered an old plan of the house in the attic. To his surprise, the plan indicated rooms and passageways he was unaware of. These hidden places were concealed behind false walls and movable panels, impossible to notice without close inspection. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, he began to search for hidden entrances. In one of the bedroom walls, he discovered a movable panel leading to a narrow passage that seemed never to have been used. Entering this dark, damp room, he felt his heart begin to race. The room was filled with old toys and children's items, covered in dust and cobwebs. He noticed dolls with gouged-out eyes, small cribs, and children's clothes stained with what looked like blood. These items exuded such a creepy atmosphere that David could barely suppress a shiver. In the corner of the room, he found an old notebook covered in dust and dirt. Opening it, he saw that the pages were filled with drawings and writings from children who had clearly experienced terrible things. The drawings depicted scenes of violence and fear, each one seeming to be an embodiment of nightmares. David realized that this room had witnessed horrific events connected to his ancestors. He felt the shadows of the past continuing to haunt him, revealing more and more grim secrets of his family. The hidden rooms and passages turned out to be repositories of the most terrifying secrets his ancestors had tried to hide from the world. Finding another entrance behind an old bookshelf, he moved aside. He discovered a narrow corridor leading to another part of the house. David couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led to even greater horror. Each step forward filled his mind with increasingly sinister forebodings, and he understood that something even more ghastly and dark awaited him. Reaching the end of the corridor, he found himself in yet another secret room. The room was dusty and long forgotten, filled with old books and papers scattered everywhere. On one of the tables lay a diary, its cover worn by time, and its pages yellowed with age. David opened it and immediately recognized his father's handwriting. His heart pounded as he began to read. With each new word he read, his world shattered. In the diary, David's father described horrific crimes he had been involved in. It turned out that his father was not only a witness but an active participant in all the atrocities committed in the house. He wrote about abductions, tortures, and murders he committed for some dark purposes. His father's words were cold and calculating, as if he felt no remorse for his actions. One of the most horrifying revelations was that many of these crimes were committed with the silent consent of other family members. David felt his blood freeze at the realization that his own family was involved in such dreadful deeds. He remembered the photographs and artifacts found in the basement and now knew who was behind these nightmares. The discovery of his father's diary shook him to the core. How could he have lived with someone capable of such brutality? David began to doubt his own morality, feeling the darkness of his ancestors pulling him into the abyss. But the most frightening realization was that the curse haunting his family was not accidental. It was deserved, and he didn't know how to break this vicious circle. David's continued investigation of his father's diary led him deeper into horror. It turned out that his ancestors had made deals with dubious figures and committed dreadful acts for wealth and power. All these decisions had led to terrible consequences that now haunted the entire family. His father's diary revealed the details of these deals. It described meetings with dark figures who promised unimaginable riches and power in exchange for certain services. These services included not only financial manipulations and deceit, but also much darker deeds, such as abductions and murders. David's ancestors would do anything for their benefit, without considering the consequences. One of the most horrifying moments was connected to the disappearance of children mentioned in the letters and diaries. David realized that these children were victims of the dark deals made by his ancestors. Their lives had been sacrificed for the family's supposed well-being. These revelations made David shudder with disgust and hatred for his own bloodline. He understood that all these crimes had not gone unnoticed. The curse looming over their family was the result of all these dreadful deeds. Each new day brought new nightmares and horrors, and David knew that the only way to break this cycle was to atone for his ancestors' sins and find a way to end their terrible legacy. After discovering the hidden rooms and the terrifying things within them, David began to hear strange whispers coming from the darkest corners of the house. At first, he tried to ignore them, but the voices grew more insistent and louder. Every night, the whispers became more distinct, filling the house with a sinister atmosphere. The voices belonged to different people, men, women, and children. They spoke in various languages and with different intonations, but they all shared one thing: despair and pain. David felt them envelop his mind, making his heart race and cold sweat break out on his forehead. One night, he heard one of the voices whisper his name. It was a child's voice, which sounded particularly eerie. David could no longer ignore it and decided to follow the voice, hoping to find the key to these ghostly phenomena. The voice led him to an old pantry on the first floor. Behind it was another secret passage that led to another basement. a secret basement. As he descended the creaky stairs, David felt the darkness wrapping around him more tightly. In the basement, he found old books and notes, their pages depicting scenes of brutal executions and tortures. The voices of the dead continued to whisper to him, pointing to specific pages. These images and records revealed more and more of the horrifying crimes committed by his ancestors. They made him feel the full weight of their sins and the horrors experienced by their victims. Each new discovery inflicted unbearable pain and suffering on David, but he knew he had to keep going. The voices of the dead guided him, as if they wanted him to learn the whole truth about his family's dark history. Before he could recover from the horrifying discoveries brought by the voices of the dead, David began receiving anonymous letters. The first letter he found on his doorstep. It bore no return address, no signature, only his name written in bold handwriting. Opening the letter, he read the gruesome details of events that happened many years ago. The descriptions were so detailed that David felt like a witness to those horrors. Each letter recounted new atrocities committed by his ancestors, torturous acts, unexplained disappearances, and brutal murders. With each new letter, his mind sank deeper into madness. He began to suspect that someone was watching him, knowing his every move. The letters came with frightening regularity, and each new message unveiled even darker chapters of his family's history. One of the letters described in detail the events related to the disappearance of children whose photographs he had found in the basement. It was so eerie and realistic that David couldn't shake the thought that the author of the letters was a direct witness or even a participant in those events. Doubts and fears began to haunt him everywhere. He started noticing strange shadows and movements in the darkness, as if someone invisible was watching him. David felt he was losing control over reality, sinking deeper into madness each day. Trying to make sense of what was happening, he meticulously studied each letter, hoping to find some clue that would help him understand who was behind these messages. However, all his attempts were in vain. The letters kept coming, each one more ominous and threatening than the last. David realized he needed to uncover this mystery, or he would go insane. But the closer he got to the truth, the more he felt like he was becoming part of this horrific story with no escape. David continued to study the diaries and letters, hoping to find a way to break the curse hanging over his family. In one of the diaries, he found an entry that revealed the whole truth. They had made sacrifices to maintain their status and success. All of this led to a curse that doomed every family member to suffering and death. David realized that he himself had become the next victim of this curse. His ancestors had left behind a trail of blood and pain, and now this darkness had caught up with him. The full awful truth crashed down on David. He understood that the curse was not only the result of his ancestors' actions, but also continued to exist because no one had tried to break this vicious cycle. His mind was filled with nightmares and terrifying visions, but he knew he could no longer live in fear. David decided that the only way to get rid of the curse was to leave the house, the source of all his suffering. But as soon as he tried to leave, the house came to life. Walls cracked, floors creaked, and shadows in the corners grew more sinister. The ghosts of the past were not ready to let him go. As he tried to escape, David felt cold hands reaching for him from the darkness. In every mirror, he saw the faces of his ancestors, twisted with malice and pain. He heard their whispers, accusing him of not deserving salvation. The cries of the victims, tormented by his family, echoed through the house, filling it with horror. David understood that he couldn't just leave. The curse was too strong. He knew he had to fight the ghosts of the past to free himself and his family from eternal torment. He gathered all his willpower and decided to return to the basement where he had found the evidence of the crimes. There, among the old artifacts and blood-stained items, he found an ancient mirror. In its reflection, he saw himself, but it wasn't him. It was the image of his ancestors, evil and full of hatred. David realized that the only way to break the curse was to shatter the mirror, destroying the connection to the past. Summoning all his strength, he smashed the mirror. And at that moment, he felt darkness envelop him. The entire house shook, and the ghosts disappeared, but he knew it was not the end. The curse would haunt him as long as he lived. Realizing this, David made his decision. He took the old knife he had found in the basement and aimed it at himself. His life was filled with horror and suffering, but he knew his death would end all the torment the curse had brought upon his family. He closed his eyes and took the final step, ending his path and breaking the vicious cycle. With his death, the house fell silent, and the darkness dissipated, leaving only silence behind.